Hi, my name is Russ Marsh, and I'd like to tell a story of how I used DNA testing to discover more about my paternal Marsh ancestry. First, I'd like to introduce to you my paternal line. It starts with me, Russell J. Marsh. I'm 52 years old and live in Linden, Utah. My father, Dennis Marsh, and my mother, Virginia, live not far from here in a cabin community. My grandfather, Ralph, passed on 20-some years ago. I knew my grandfather well and loved him, and I will refer to him as Ralph throughout the presentation. So my great-grandfather I did not know. My father was 6 when William Alfred Marsh died. William Alfred Marsh was actually born during or possibly slightly after the Civil War. So he was quite aged even when my father was a boy. But my father remembers him well and thinks very fondly of him. When my father was just a small boy, William Alfred Marsh held he and his older brother on his knee and promised each of them a years of service watch that he'd received from the railroad. And so my Uncle Lavar received a gold years of service watch as the eldest grandson, and my father, the second eldest grandson, received his silver years of service watch. This is a picture of the watch that my dad still has today. William Alfred Marsh's father is Abraham Marsh, my second great-grandfather. Abraham Marsh fought in the Civil War. He mustered out of Iowa and fought for the duration of the war. He served as a teamster for the Union Army. And here's a picture of the Civil War bayonet that my father has in his possession today. It's the Civil War bayonet of Abraham Marsh. We know about 2 additional generations of Marshes. So James Marsh is the most distant known paternal ancestor. And James, as far as we believe, he may have been born in New Jersey. Most of what we know of James Marsh is from records that existed while he lived in northern Kentucky, and subsequently he moved his family across the Ohio River into southern Ohio, where he died in 1823 and was buried. So my grandfather Ralph, my Aunt Eileen, and myself, along with other Marsh researchers, have spent an interminable amount of time trying to find out who the parents are of James Marsh. And after all these many years, it's still unknown who his parents are. And we've effectively reached a dead end. So I decided in the 2006 time frame, why not try DNA testing? So let me talk to the value proposition. Why would I try DNA testing? What would I expect to learn from DNA testing? So there's a particular test that is very, very helpful in family history testing, and that is the testing of the Y chromosome in males. And the reason the Y chromosome test is very interesting is because the Y chromosome is passed from father to son largely unmodified. And in fact, over many hundreds to thousands of years, the Y chromosome does not vary much at all over time. So the Y chromosome becomes a very effective marker of who a man's paternal genealogy is. Unfortunately, it's difficult, if not impossible, for a man to compare his Y chromosome against those of his paternal ancestors. So the value add comes by comparing our Y DNA with thousands, and over time, as the sample set grows, millions of individuals, and hopefully finding matches that can begin a conversation. a conversation that hopefully would reveal more information about one's paternal ancestry. So my hope was that I could identify some living Marsh relatives who I could interact with, and perhaps between what I know about James Marsh and what they could share about James Marsh, we could make a breakthrough and discover who his parents are. That's the proposition. So in 2006 timeframe, I chose Family Tree DNA as my DNA testing company. And I chose them for two reasons. One, because they have a very large database of Y-DNA samples. The second reason I chose them is because they host surname projects. This is a type of social networking that allows people with a common surname to get together and network, compare their Y-DNA, and establish relationships with other individuals who have whose DNA matches theirs. So I paid for the test. I took the cheek swab in 2006, and then I began the painful wait for my DNA results. It took 4 to 6 weeks. I don't recall exactly. I just remember it was painful for my Y-DNA results to come back. And when they came back, I was met with a couple of surprises. The first surprise has to do with what's called a haplogroup. My DNA is classified in the haplogroup JM172. So first, what is a haplogroup? A haplogroup is a way of classifying similar DNA in a way that allows historians and anthropologists to talk about that haplogroup's ancient origin, about migration patterns, and any other kind of information that would be helpful to study about a haplogroup. So I'm part of JM172, and the surprise in that comes from the fact that its ancient origin is not European. I'm Caucasian American. My supposition my entire life is that my family history on all sides is European. And for my paternal Y-DNA to come back and say that I'm not of European origin was a surprise. So a little bit more about JM172. It originates in the Fertile Crescent, or a region of the world that anthropologists refer to as the Levant. The Levant extends from the Caucasus Mountains on the north down to the northern edge of Saudi Arabia on the south. And it extends from Turkey on the west over to the western portions of Iran on the east. And it includes countries such as Iraq, Syria, and Israel. So one likely scenario that describes my non-European origin could be a Jewish or Hebrew family that migrated hundreds to thousands of years ago from the Levant or from Palestine into Europe or the British Isles, and then integrated with the European people. So, surprise number one. Surprise number two, I discover when I search the database for matches against my Y-DNA. Now, you can see that in this search, I'm restricting the results to matches of the surname Marsh. So I run the report and find that I'm not related to any of the Marshes in the Marsh database or in the Marsh surname project. And this leaves me scratching my head. 169 Marshes in the Marsh surname project, plus an unknown number of other Marshes in the database who have not chosen to be part of the surname project. They represent Marshes from the United States, from Western, Northern Europe, the British Isles, and even from New Zealand and Australia, and I don't match any of them. I do not share a common paternal ancestor with any of the Marshes in the database. So, what do I do next? I decided to work off of a supposition that even though there are at least 169 Marshes in the database, coincidentally, none that I'm related to have participated to date in the study. So I decided to look through my family tree and find a relative distant enough to provide some useful information, but not so close that it doesn't reveal anything. For example, if I had my father participate in the study, it would only tell me the obvious, and that is that his Y chromosome is identical to mine, and I will have learned nothing. I did some research, and I found a gentleman, a distant cousin that I'll refer to as Oregon Marsh. And Oregon and his wife are active participants in family history, which gave me the confidence to reach out, get to know them a little bit, and invite them at my expense to participate in the Y-DNA project. So they agreed. I paid for a Y-DNA test, submitted the results, and waited our 4 to 6 weeks, and the results returned. Let's take a look at the results that came back. So this is comparing Oregon Marsh's Y-DNA against the entire database. And I have blanked out all first names in this. But you can see from the results that all of the matches that most closely match Oregon Marsh have the surname Marsh. You'll also notice that I'm not in that list. So this suggests two things. It suggests, first of all, that Oregon Marsh is related to Marshes in the database, but more importantly, we know that I am not. I'm not related to the Marshes in the database, and I'm very specifically not related to Oregon Marsh. In other words, Oregon Marsh and I do not share a common paternal ancestor. Okay, so what else can I learn from these results? I take a look at a couple of the Marshes in the database here, and I notice that they descend from a Peter Marsh, who is a known relative of James Marsh. So this connection ties Oregon Marsh to these two Marshes and proves genetically that he does indeed descend from James Marsh. Well, if Oregon Marsh descends from James Marsh, and it's conclusive, and I don't share a common paternal ancestor with James Marsh, then I can only conclude that I do not descend from James Marsh. So, looking back at our paper history here, with Abraham Marsh as the patriarch in this view, and Oregon Marsh and I, on paper, second cousins once removed, and yet we don't share a common paternal ancestor. We know that Oregon Marsh is related to the Marsh family, and I'm not related to him. So from this viewpoint, where we supposedly share a common paternal ancestor in Abraham Marsh, the conclusion has to be that I'm not related paternally or genetically to Abraham Marsh. So another way to view this would be to bring son of Peter Marsh 1. This is the name I gave to one of the individuals in the search results, where son of Peter Marsh 1 descends from Peter Marsh, who is a son of James Marsh. And Oregon Marsh is proven genetically to share a common paternal ancestor with him. then I'm the lone man, the lone wolf over here who's not related. And so not only do I not share a common paternal ancestor with either of these individuals, this is another view that illustrates that I cannot be related to James Marsh or down through his grandson Abraham. So what next? I am very comfortable concluding that Dennis Marsh is my father. And I'm equally comfortable in concluding that William Ralph Marsh is my grandfather. So this is a prerogative that I claim. A thorough researcher might find that logic faulty, but I don't suspect or have any reason to believe otherwise. What that means is it leaves us with two possibilities. Number one, that Abraham Marsh is not the father, genetically, of William Alfred Marsh. Or number two, that William Alfred Marsh, my great-grandfather, is not the father of William Ralph Marsh, my grandfather. So, it might be interesting to ask the question, if I'm not related to any of the Marshes in Family Tree DNA database, from a Y chromosome search, what would happen if I removed the restriction on the surname Marsh and searched the entire database to see who I might be related to? Let's run that report. Very surprising result. Of almost 800,000 Y DNA samples in the database, 4 out of the 5 top matches to my Y DNA have the surname Smith. And after some research into and a little bit of social networking, contacting these different Smiths, I find that they all claim through their family history to descend from a man by the name of Peter Smith, who lived in the late 1600s, early 1700s in Westmoreland, Virginia. So these 4 Smiths are highly related to each other, and I am highly related to them. In other words, the likelihood is very, very high that I share a common paternal ancestor with them in recent generations. So the likelihood is very high that Peter Smith is is anciently a paternal ancestor of mine. Let's look at this again. So we've just observed that at some point in time, I likely am genetically descended from Smiths rather than Marshes. So going back to our 2 hypotheticals, what we're really saying is that either William Alfred Marsh is not the son of Abraham Marsh, but was fathered rather by some Mr. Smith. Or alternatively, my grandfather, William Ralph Marsh, is not the son of William Alfred Marsh, but was instead fathered by some Mr. Smith. Those are the 2 possibilities that the evidence suggests. So where do you go from here? I have 2 conjectures. We're probably looking at about the 2008 time frame at this point in my research. And I decide to go down the path of conjecture number 1, that William Alfred Marsh is not the son of Abraham Marsh, that some Mr. Smith fathered Bill sometime during or shortly after the Civil War. So this route took me down a very, very intriguing path. The problem that faced me was finding some Smith that would know the Marsh family at the time frame when my great-grandfather would have been conceived. And as luck would have it, I find that Abraham Marsh's father, Jesse, had lost his second wife and married, during the Civil War, married a young girl who was the victim of an incestuous relationship with her father, Aaron Smith. So the significance of this is that we have a Smith who was known to the Marshes in some fashion by virtue of the fact that his oldest daughter, who he had fathered a child with, had married the older Jesse Marsh. Jesse was about 71 years old, and Martha Ann Smith was 18 and had a child. My wife and I have studied this in great depth and decided that Jesse Marsh had done a very kind thing. And here's a girl in the early 1860s with a child that might have a hard time in life, where that was socially difficult in those days to be in that situation. And here is Jesse Marsh, 71 years old and widowed, and he takes this girl into his home. Not only does he take Martha Ann into his home, but he takes her younger siblings into the home as well. And it seems like a remarkable thing on his part. So a little bit more, Aaron Smith becomes the central figure at this point. Is it possible that Aaron Smith knew Jesse and his son Abraham, and more importantly, Abraham's wife, Lucinda? So Aaron Smith had become a figure in the area by virtue of the fact that he had committed incest with his oldest daughter. So there was a highly publicized trial. He was not highly thought of, naturally, and he was eventually released because Martha Ann refused to testify against him. So there was a great deal of feeling in the community against Aaron Smith, and most particularly among Martha Ann's uncle's family, the older brother of her deceased mother. So her uncle and her cousin had a conflict with Aaron Smith over the fact that Aaron had committed incest. And there were two distinct incidents. One where Aaron Smith stabbed his nephew, not fatally, and a second incident a year later when Aaron Smith was shot in the back while he drove a wagon into the hills to cut some timber. And as Aaron Smith died, he fingered this nephew whom he had previously stabbed as the triggerman. So the nephew was captured, put on trial, and ultimately acquitted. Newspaper articles and court records suggest that he was acquitted because the only evidence against him was the word of a dying man who was held in ill repute. So Aaron Smith is dead, and he still is he died in 1864. Now it's possible that my great-grandfather William Alfred Marsh was conceived after that time frame, which would inherently make Aaron Smith impossible of being his father. But I didn't know whether that was the case or not because the exact birth year of my great-grandfather William Alfred Marsh is unclear. So I continued to proceed down this path of conjecture that Aaron Smith could be the father of William Alfred Marsh. And the path from here could only lead in one direction. I absolutely needed a living male descendant of Aaron Smith to participate in the DNA study. So I spent a great deal of time trying to sort out the complexities of the Aaron Smith family, and eventually met a man who I will refer to as Dakota Smith. And interestingly, Dakota and his wife were also active in family history research and were willing to participate in the study, once again at my expense. So I paid the money, and the result came back 6 weeks later, and proved that I have no paternal relationship whatsoever with Dakota Smith. So as interesting as this whole journey has been, and as interesting as the story's been, the net effect is it led nowhere. And I'm left with no conclusion as to whether Abraham Marsh is or is not the father of William Alfred Marsh. So at this point, I'm ready to move on to conjecture number 2, because I don't know where else to proceed with conjecture number 1. So conjecture number 2 is that William Ralph Marsh, my grandfather, is not the son of William Alfred Marsh. That some Mr. Smith fathered Ralph in 1908. He was born in 1909 and conceived in 1908. So 1908 becomes a year that we want to focus on, because if a Mr. Smith indeed did father my grandfather, that would be the time frame that we need to study. Let me first introduce some of the characters involved. So these pictures are of William Alfred Marsh, my great-grandfather. And William Alfred Marsh was born somewhere in 1864 to 1867 time frame. And his family, his father Abraham, his mother Lucinda, and the kids migrated from the Iowa area to southern Missouri, and from there they migrated westward over a period of years, and they made stops in Nebraska, Colorado, and Sweetwater, Wyoming, before they ended up in the Boise, Idaho area. And while they were in Sweetwater, Wyoming, Bill's father, Abraham Marsh, died. So that's Bill Marsh. Professionally, Bill was a teamster, just like his father Abraham, and also his brother John. But eventually the railroad came through Boise, and by 1908 we find Bill working for the Oregon Short Line Railroad. He's listed in Boise City directories as at one point a hostler, and another point as a repairman for the Oregon Short Line. The likelihood is that those are one and the same. The definition of a hostler in railroad terms is someone who drove a locomotive to the yard for maintenance and repair. Now let's turn to Bill's wife, Pearl. Minnie Pearl Maynard is approximately 17 years younger than Bill, and in fact married Bill at the age of 15. In the upper left-hand corner, I've extracted this picture of Pearl from the family photo to show what she might have looked like when Bill married her. So she's 15 and Bill's 31, and in some senses you have to imagine that she's just a child stepping into family life, childbearing, and you can imagine that at that young age that she had to grow up in a hurry. A couple stories about Pearl of interest. First of all, the Maynards lived just outside of Joseph, Oregon, in a very remote farming community, or not a community, I mean a remote farm where the nearest neighbors were a distance away. And it was also the area where the Nez Perce Indians lived. And Chief Joseph is the famous chief of the Nez Perce Indians who resisted the United States Army in driving them from their lands in Oregon and Idaho. One time, Pearl and her sister were riding their horses, and they ran into Chief Joseph while he was on the warpath. And her account is that he was very gentlemanly and was concerned about their welfare. Now, another story that gives you some color of what her life was like. In the lower left-hand corner, you can see her mother and father, Hiram Maynard and Mary Jane Chapman. And Mary Jane Chapman died a couple years before the family photo that you see was taken. And Pearl tells the story that her father was traveling, that neighbors came, and that they laid her mother's body on a board and left her there until their father would return. And so Pearl was quite traumatized by the fact that her mother's dead body was laying there. You can understand that she naturally would be. So on the right is a family portrait of Pearl as a young mother, and you can see that she's beautiful, and I particularly have studied this photo and been entranced by her eyes. I think her eyes are very, very lovely. So that's Pearl Maynard Marsh, my great-grandmother. The only other story I would tell you about Pearl is she had a reputation for being a little bit stern. And I only met Pearl in my recollection one time when I was a very young, I think I was in the 6 to 7 year old range. And the only thing I remember about my great-grandmother Pearl is that I was in my grandmother's kitchen and I was trying to reach for some snacks in the cupboard, and she whacked me with her cane. So that's the legacy that lives with me, unfortunately. But her grandchildren say that she was kind and loving, but that she could occasionally be a little bit crotchety. So that's Bill and Pearl. They married in 1898 and ended up having 4 children together. So the question is, can I make a case? Is there evidence, circumstantial or otherwise, that would suggest that Pearl had some kind of relationship, forced or voluntary, with a Mr. Smith that resulted in the birth of my grandfather, William Ralph Marsh? So some of the things that we know, family lore suggests that Pearl had a long-standing affair. It doesn't identify the individual. Family lore does not know who the individual was. But it's well understood that she had a long-standing affair. And as the story goes, her lover refused to leave his family for her. Another thing that was known about Pearl is that she loved to dance. You can understand that she was young when she married, had a lot of life in her. Her husband was a little older and was away a great deal. And it was known that Pearl would, on occasion, go dancing. I've heard alternatively that she would visit the mining camps and dance, or that she would dance in dance halls in Boise. Another interesting thing about this situation is that both Pearl and her husband Bill were not large in stature. In fact, Pearl was said to not quite be 5 feet in height. And Bill was thought to be in the 5'7" range. So my grandfather, their son, Ralph Marsh, was 6'4" tall. And it's certainly not impossible genetically for a large man to be born of shorter parents. but it is noteworthy. Bill and Pearl's relationship ended in a divorce in 1922, and the divorce decree states that Bill had been, that it was very clear that Bill had been substantially cruel to Pearl for an extended period of time. And in the divorce decree, Bill made no defense on his behalf. That's a very, very poor record to describe what might have happened over the years of their marriage, but it certainly has to be noted here as we try to make a case for this Ralph being the result of a relationship other than with Bill. So the next thing I have to do, I think there's there's enough evidence to make it worthwhile to pursue this further. The problem I run up against is initially I can't find any Smiths who seem to be in the neighborhood of the Marshes in a relevant time frame. The first place I look is the 1910 census, and I find nothing. So if you recall, my grandfather Ralph was born in 1909. The 1910 census, I thought, should likely lead me to some Smiths who may have been neighbors to or known the Marshes, but in fact it does not. So after a period of time, I make a breakthrough. What I find is that Pearl's father, Hiram Maynard, who's a widower, marries a woman by the name of Lavina Smith in 1910. So nothing in that proves that any Smiths knew Pearl and Bill, but it certainly suggests that they would have known, that Pearl would have certainly known her father's new wife in his old age, and therefore that Bill likely would have as well. As it turns out, Lavina Smith had divorced a man by the name of Herschel Alonzo Smith in 1909. So Herschel Alonzo Smith is a person of interest to me. So let's find out what we can learn about Herschel Alonzo Smith. The very first thing that I did is I researched his ancestry. And what I found was intriguing. Herschel Alonzo Smith is a direct paternal descendant of the same Peter Smith that I'm genetically proven to descend from. In other words, Herschel Alonzo Smith and I share a common paternal ancestor. So my interest level in Herschel Alonzo Smith goes up at this point. Let's take a look at, this is a map of the Boise area currently, but let's try to imagine the year 1908. In 1908, I've drawn a black line here that illustrates where the railroad tracks were that came through Boise, Idaho. And down in the lower right-hand corner, this pin is where the old Boise train depot was. Just a block up the road is the freight depot. So this is the center of the railroad universe in Boise. And in the 1908 Boise City Directory, we find William Alfred Marsh living not far from the depots and right near the tracks. Also, in the 1908 Boise City Directory, we find Herschel Alonzo Smith living on the same block as Bill Marsh and his wife Pearl. So keep in mind, this is the 1908 Boise City Directory. They are neighbors in 1908. 1908 is the year that my grandfather was conceived. Nothing conclusive here, right? We know that Herschel's ex-wife married into Pearl's family. We know that Herschel was a neighbor in 1908, but did they know each other? Another breakthrough. In fact, just this year, my wife and I were searching the archives of the Idaho Statesman. And in 1906, we find this article. Herschel A. Smith yesterday filed a complaint with Justice Savage in which he charged William Marsh, a freighter living in the southwest part of the city, with having threatened to take his life. Definitely appears that Herschel Smith and Bill Marsh knew each other. Later in the same month, the Idaho Statesman reports the complaint of Herschel Smith against William Marsh, in which Smith alleged that Marsh had threatened his life, which was no longer in safety, was dismissed yesterday by Judge Savage. So we've clearly established that they knew each other. It's time to take this a step further. So with some effort, I'm able to discover a living male descendant of Herschel Alonzo Smith. And I'm going to refer to this gentleman as Minnesota Smith. Minnesota Smith is has become a friend, and we haven't met in person yet, but we've chatted on the phone many times, shared a lot of emails. And Minnesota Smith was initially reticent to participate in the DNA study. But as we got to know each other, he became more and more comfortable. And eventually, he accepted my offer to pay for it. He took the test, and after 6 weeks, the results came back. So let's take a look at the results. What we're going to do here is compare my Y DNA against all samples in the database, and look what we find. The same 4 Smiths as previously are shown in the list as matches, but tops on the list is Minnesota Smith. By looking a little bit closer at this with statistical models that family tree DNA provides, the likelihood that Minnesota Smith and I share a common paternal ancestor in recent generations is very high. So, I am encouraged by this. This suggests that the supposition that Herschel Alonzo Smith fathered my grandfather, William Ralph Marsh, seems quite likely at this point. But I'm not satisfied. Quite likely doesn't work for me very well. My wife is feeling quite conclusive at this point. She thinks the evidence is strong, but something in me needs to have more proof. Minnesota sent to us a picture of his grandfather. So let's take a look at these individuals. In the center box are pictures, 4 different pictures of my grandfather, William Ralph Marsh. On the left are a couple pictures of Bill Marsh, and on the right is a picture that Minnesota sent to me of Herschel Alonzo Smith. So let's compare Bill and Ralph first. If you look at Bill's face, Bill had a rounded features, whereas Ralph's face was somewhat narrow, a little bit elongated. I can't see anything in the comparison that jumps out at me and says, Bill, you are my great-grandfather. You are Ralph Marsh's father. Now, if I turn and look at this single picture that we have of Herschel Alonzo Smith, my wife and I have studied it. We've talked ourselves into and out of the resemblances between Herschel Alonzo Smith and my grandfather Ralph. The bottom line for me when doing these feature comparisons is that I can't see anything that would say that Bill is Ralph's father, but I could not also look at Herschel and say that's Ralph's father. So the picture comparisons really don't provide the added proof that I'm looking for. So the next step is autosomal DNA testing. So let me just talk real briefly about what autosomal DNA testing is, as I understand it. The Y DNA testing that we've done talked about previously has to do with the single sex chromosome that is passed from a father to his son. And from your genetics class, you'll remember that an individual receives 23 chromosomes from its father and 23 chromosomes from its mother. One of those chromosomes in each set is a sex chromosome, an X or a Y chromosome. The other 22 chromosomes are referred to as autosomal. They're non-sex chromosomes, but they do encode important information in them that can lead us to understand family relationships. So how that works as opposed to a Y-DNA approach is because it's a non-sex chromosome test, it applies to females equally as it does to males, whereas the Y chromosome test is purely a test that shows a man's paternal line. And also, an autosomal DNA test is different from a Y DNA test in terms of how far back it can show us about our relationships. So a Y chromosome test is very vertical. It goes along your paternal line, father to father to father to father. But it goes back very many generations and is accurate to many, many generations back in time. An autosomal DNA test, on the other hand, can branch out and talk about cousins and second cousins and third cousins. But the autosomal DNA test isn't useful genealogically very far back in time. So the Family Finder test or autosomal test provided by Family Tree DNA can only reveal relationships that go back about 5 generations. So you've already been studying these results. They're sitting here staring us in the face. Let's talk about them. I have blanked out the names of the second and the third match in this list, as well as their pictures. You can see that the second and third individuals in the list are both estimated to be my second, third, or fourth cousins. And Minnesota Smith sits on top of my list. I'm much more related to Minnesota Smith from an autosomal standpoint than anybody else in the database. And the autosomal, the Family Finder test, suggests that he and I are between first and third cousins, most likely second cousins. So a second cousin would share common great-grandparents. So if we look at Minnesota Smith and myself, we are one generation removed from each other. Minnesota Smith is very close to my father's age. And he is the grandson of Herschel Alonzo Smith, where I would actually be the great-grandson. And so that would make Minnesota and I first cousins once removed. And I have noted that where it says first cousin once removed, I've edited that myself because I've concluded that that in fact is our relationship. And I've concluded based on the combination of Y DNA and autosomal DNA, as well as the circumstantial data around Pearl and Bill, I have absolutely concluded that I am the great-grandson of Herschel Alonzo Smith. Let's just walk quickly through the evidence that that we have. First of all, Bill and Pearl were small in stature. Ralph, on the other hand, was 6'4". At some point in time, Bill and Pearl's relationship devolved and ended in 1922. So family lore tells us that Pearl had a long-standing relationship and that her lover refused to leave his family for her. Herschel Alonzo Smith was neighbors with Bill and Pearl the year that my grandfather Ralph was conceived. Herschel and Bill both worked for the Oregon Short Line Railroad in 1908. Herschel was in a failing marriage in 1908, which ended in 1909. Herschel filed a complaint that Bill had threatened his life in 1906. Herschel descends from the same Peter Smith that I am genetically proven to descend from. Y DNA proves Herschel's grandson Minnesota Smith and I share a recent paternal ancestor. Autosomal DNA tests prove that Minnesota Smith and I are very close cousins, likely second, and in my estimation, first cousins once removed. So one note here is based on all of this evidence and assuming that I'm correct in my conclusion that Herschel is my great-grandfather, this would make my father and his siblings first cousins of Minnesota Smith. So what are my final thoughts on this? What does it mean? The most important conclusion that I would end with is that I'm still a Marsh, and I always will be. I'm proud of my Marsh heritage. I like my Marsh name. I'm bonded to William Alfred Marsh in the stories that I've heard of him. I feel bonded to Abraham Marsh, who fought in the Civil War. I've held his Civil War bayonet in my hands. I am very content to say that I am a Marsh. But I can't ignore that I also have a Smith heritage. And what does that mean? Not entirely sure right now. I'm still discovering how I feel about that and what, if anything, it affects in my life, in my thoughts about who I am. So I don't really know what it means, but I do know that I'm very happy to be a Marsh. I have 7 brothers who all have the surname Marsh, and I take a lot of pride in the fact that us Marsh boys have created a whole lot of stories together. I think DNA testing should be considered for some instances where people have reached a dead end and want to know more. It's clear that if you don't know more than you think you want to know, you have to be careful because there are surprises in store. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my story.